Good afternoon. Welcome to the annual Women Empowerment Conference at Morton College. My name is Sarah Helmus, one of the committee members for the Women Empowerment Conference, and we are so glad to have you here. Just a few housekeeping things. You are more than welcome to share your video, but we ask that you are on mute while our speaker is speaking. Put questions in the chat as we go throughout, and we will make sure that they get answered. Okay. The session is being recorded, and that recording will post on the website later on. So if you weren't able to join us live, you'll have access to the information. And our speaker today is Asiyya Ashraf, a full-time faculty member at Morton College who teaches microbiology, anatomy and physiology, and biology courses, but has a hobby of gardening. And she is going to share with us about tomatoes, right? A plant that keeps on giving, literally, and more, and some of what she does in her free time as a hobby. So Asiyya, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Sarah Helmus. Like you had mentioned, I am a full-time faculty member at Morton College. And so I teach courses such as microbiology, anatomy, physiology, as well as environmental biology. And so I have a Mastering Gardening Certificate course completion from the University of Oregon. And so on my free time, I like to do home gardening as a hobby. And so that's what I would like to present to you today. All right. Making sure this panel is showing correctly. All right, so as we get into the presentation, there's just a couple of remarks I'd like to make. Whatever recommendations I make are recommendations based on my own experience. And so if you'd like to learn more about any of these topics, please do your due diligence as far as researching this stuff is concerned. And so really everything that we're discussing is just based on my own personal experience. The second thing that I want to note is that I will be showing you patented products that I've experienced that are good for home gardeners. And so I'm in no way affiliated with any of these products, sponsored or anything. And so whatever I show you is just, again, based off my own experience. All right, so let's get started. Now, before I discuss this title, A Plant That Keeps on Giving, literally, I'm of course referring to, in case the title slide didn't make this, certain, I'm referring to, of course, the tomato plant. All right. And so really we can get into, why is it that tomatoes are so important as far as what are the health benefits that they provide. And so what you see is a panel to your right, which highlights some of the major vitamins and minerals that tomatoes have. And so what you notice is that 27% of your daily value of vitamin C comes from tomatoes, if they are included in your diet. Now, vitamin C, as well as zinc, which is under the minerals panel, which you can see, it's 3% of your daily intake. Both vitamin C and zinc play immune modulatory roles. And what that means is that they're good for your immune system, right? And so with the situation that we have right now with a pandemic, a viral pandemic, really one of the best ways in trying to combat this problem or to protect yourself from the virus is to maintain a very healthy and robust immune system. And so including tomatoes in your diet really does play a role and help you to do that. All right. So we also see that 12% comes from vitamin K. And vitamin K, as well as calcium, and there is calcium, believe it or not, in tomatoes, right? So vitamin K, as well as calcium, are going to be involved in bone maintenance, right? So things such as growth as well as repair will be part of one of the things that vitamin K and calcium are able to do. All right. So that leads us to the next vitamin. We see vitamin A, okay? So vitamin A is a compound called retinol, okay? Retinol in your body is a precursor for a pigment in your eye that helps you adapt to dark vision, right? So if you're at night, right, night driving, for example, is a big issue, and you're not able to see in dim light, well, that could be indicative of low vitamin A levels, right? So to be able to see clearly in the dark, as clear as possible, right? To be able to differentiate between light and dark, acquiring vitamin A is going to help for sure. All right. So now I'm not going to go through all of the B vitamins, but as you can see, how many B vitamins do you think are included as one of the vitamins in tomatoes, right? So we see 6 of them. Now, there are a total of 8 B vitamin complexes that your body needs, okay? And out of those 8, there's 6 in tomatoes. That's a pretty good number if you ask me, right? So 6 of these B vitamins are in tomatoes. And so B vitamins have an important role as far as cardiovascular health is concerned. Now, there are obviously different B vitamins. Each of these B vitamins essentially help your body cells perform their specific functions accordingly. Okay, now I'm honing in on cardiovascular health, considering that oftentimes problems with this system lead to common pathologies like high cholesterol, right, high blood pressure. And so acquiring vitamin B can help with reducing those levels. All right, so muscle cramps, that's often a common complaint for people, right? So muscle cramps, what can help with that is magnesium. And guess what? Tomatoes have a good amount of magnesium. So that's 5% of your daily value. We've got magnesium as well as different electrolytes like potassium and sodium as well in tomatoes. So that's good to keep in mind. You've heard of this in commercials probably. And what I'm talking about is our antioxidant, which is lycopene, okay? So lycopene is an antioxidant and it helps with different types of cancers. So prostate cancer, bone cancer, lung cancer. There is a correlation between acquiring lycopene, so having a diet that's high in lycopene, and having a reduction in these cancers. So I just want to make it clear that the scientific studies that have been done, they're correlations. So this is not cause and effect really. But we can have a good idea, even with correlations, that a diet high in lycopene has been shown to reduce cancer levels. All right. Now, this goes without saying that tomatoes are a very important product of, or an important ingredient used in all sorts of cuisines, right? So if you're talking about Spanish cuisine, right? In the case of salsa, for example, if you're talking about a European cuisine, right? So your classical tomato soup, right? If you're talking about Italian cuisine, you know, in the context of marinara sauce or ratatouille, for example, right? Heck, something you probably all have in your kitchen, which of course is ketchup, right? So all of these things, you know, an integral part or integral or main ingredient of all these dishes is the infamous tomato. All right, so now, you know, how much do we consume, right? Do we consume a lot of it on average as Americans or not so much? Well, the answer is that if we were to take the average, and these averages are compiled for 19 years, and that's the chart that you see on your right-hand side. So on the bottom here, you'll see years. So this is from 2000 to 2019. And on the y-axis, you'll see the pounds that an individual intakes per year, okay? And so if we look at 2019, we can see this is approximately 20 pounds per individual of tomatoes that we are acquiring, right? That's a lot. This is approximately about 1/3 of a cup every day, all right? And let me tell you how big this industry is. This is an over $2 billion industry as far as manufacturing and producing tomatoes in the United States, right? So big numbers there. So I guess the question of the day is that, is it worth growing your own tomatoes, right? Now, I'm underlining the word worth. And when we think of this word, we think of cost, right? Is it cost effective to grow your own tomatoes? And what I want to say is this, is that on average, the retail price of tomatoes per pound is $1.89. Okay, doesn't seem so expensive. Now, this is an average compiled over multiple states, so that's important to keep in mind. This is also a number that's compiled over multiple seasons, right? So there can be seasons like, for example, obviously during the winter, the price of tomatoes is going to jump exponentially. And if there's a bad growing year for whatever reasons, it could be because of climate, it could be because of crop deterioration due to some sort of infection, right? So if you have cases like that, this number can greatly fluctuate, right? So this $1.89 really is an average. Doesn't seem that expensive. Now, how does this compare with how much it might cost to grow your own tomatoes? And the answer is that the comparison is not very straightforward in the sense that, number one, it depends on which type of variety you're trying to grow. Okay, so if this variety requires more water or a certain temperature in order to grow, that's going to influence your price. The second thing that's going to influence your price is where you're growing them, right? So in a warmer climate, a larger growing season will allow for higher crop yields. Okay, so it depends on where you're growing them. It also depends on whether or not you are a novice or a experienced grower. Okay, and the person that you see in the picture here seems to be looks like that she's proficient with what she has. And so then it also comes down to the supplies that are required in order to grow these tomatoes, right? So are you purchasing your seeds from a local garden center, or are you purchasing them from a commercial vendor? Or if you are saving your own seeds and trying to grow those, right? Now, we'll get into that conversation in just a little bit, but really your supplies will ultimately determine your price as well. So again, it's your level of expertise, it's where you're growing them, and it's which supplies you're using. All of these will ultimately determine what the end price of your tomatoes will be. And these are such varying things, right? So for example, expertise, has a very large range, right? How proficient you feel like you are, how comfortable you are, how well you've in tuned with your home garden, right? So if you're in tune with it, meaning you know the pH of your soil, you know exactly which nutrients you have, you know that profile, that's great. And so ultimately, all these factors will come into play. I want to go back to this word again, worth, right? And before I was defining worth in the context of economics, in the context of money, right? Is it cost effective, really? And so what we know is that usually, and this is surveys that are done from different sources, I don't have one to share with you right now, but what you will notice is that the majority of the gardeners would say that the flavor composition, the color, the texture of a homegrown tomato is much better than a store-bought tomato. And this has to do when the fruit is plucked, okay? So when you buy tomatoes from the store, chances are the fruit hasn't ripened. They've plucked it early so that it will allow enough time for transportation and for other things to happen before they get into the store shelves, before they get into your fridge, before they enter your mouth. Okay, so there are multiple stages that need to happen before that. And so to allow for enough time for each one of these events to occur, it has to be that the fruit needs to be plucked ahead of time. Okay, so if it were to ripen while it's still on the plant, well, it's not going to make it very far. Why? Because it'll have that texture. It'll be quite soft. In transportation, no good, right? And so a lot of times, all these attributes, flavor, color, texture, have to do with how long the fruit is intact with the plant, right? So if it's on the plant longer, it's better. And so all of these components are influenced by how much juice there is in the fruit, right? Juice is going to influence flavor, color, and texture. And again, if you're extracting the fruit early, chances are that juice is going to dehydrate. When it dehydrates, it's going to take a little bit away from the color, the texture, as well as the flavor. All right. So now you have two different varieties in front of you right now. One's a Sweet 100 variety. Okay, this is a cherry tomato variety. And one of them is my personal favorite, actually, which is the Sun Gold orange cherry tomato. Now, these varieties are difficult to find at the store. And so by being a home grower, you can essentially choose from whatever varieties are in the catalog, essentially. So you have much greater variety, much greater choice. Now, again, going back to that cost aspect, it can be the case that it is cheaper to grow your own tomatoes. Okay, so it can be. Now, this is a conditional statement in the sense that if you're living in a warm climate, right? If you're saving your seeds, if you're using your own compost, right? So vegetable organic scraps from the kitchen and using that as fertilizer, okay, it can be cost effective. So it is possible. Again, it's a whole host of things, a whole host of variables you need to keep in mind in order to evaluate cost effectiveness. And then, of course, one of my personal favorites, which is, of course, the intrinsic fulfillment. How accomplished do you feel to grow your tomato plant, right? Like, and I like to compare this to having a pet, right? You're taking care of a living organism. And so with home gardening, it is the case that that organism at the end of the season will bear fruit. Might not be true for your house pet, but I think you get the idea. You might get some other kind of fruit, but yeah. All right, so let's go ahead and begin the process of thinking about what you're going to have to consider when you're starting off your tomato plant. Okay, so you have two options. Option one is to take your tomato plant and plant it in a pot versus ground. Now, in both scenarios, there are advantages and disadvantages. Okay, so let's just quickly go through it. So some of the advantages of growing in a pot is the following. I guess we can start off by saying, why would you even want to grow in a pot, right? Why is that relevant? Well, it's relevant for people who don't have land space, right? So if you don't have a garden, so if you're living in an apartment or condominium, this is your only option, right? This is all what you can do. And so taking the pot route is probably the best option. The growing in ground would not be an option at that point, and so the choice is clear. But what's good about planting in a pot? Well, you can grow indoors out of season if you are growing a plant in a pot. Now, that might seem like really an interesting aspect. That is true. But what you need to keep in mind is this, is that if you are growing a plant indoors out of season, chances are the price will be very high for this, in the sense that you will have to have grow lights on majority of the day. Okay, so this is going to influence your electricity bill. You're going to have to keep this plant at a specific temperature. So not the temperature that you might like to have the room set at, right? So if you're one of those people who likes 68 degrees or anything below 70 degrees, or even below 75 degrees, this might be hard for you to maintain, right? So you're going to have to keep a heat source close by the plant, okay? Now, another thing with growing in a pot, again, you have that flexibility of bringing the plant indoors. And so you can put the pot in a controlled environment, right? So that means you can control how much water, how much light, likely yielding in better fruit, but not necessarily. So that's also conditional. It depends on what type of lights you're using as well. If you're thinking that a table lamp is good enough for your tomato plant, that's not going to be the case. So what I'm going to show you is this. Here is a classical grow light. This is what it looks like. I don't think I'll get it in the screen, but this is what it is. And what these are LED lights that provide a very specific wavelength of light. So they're going to provide your red, your blue, your purple wavelengths, the wavelengths that your plant is going to need in order to grow. Okay, so grow lights are essential. Now, how much are they going to cost you? Well, once you purchase them, you don't need to worry about them, but the cost for these particular ones that I purchased at the local garden center was around $40. Okay, so you're going to need maybe 2 of these in order to have a good, healthy plant at the end of the day. All right. Now, some of the disadvantages of planting in a pot, obviously, you are limited to the yield size. Now, the larger your pot, the better. And how large, you're probably wondering? Well, you want to purchase a pot that's at a minimum 2 gallons. Okay, so you can range from 2 gallons to 5 gallons. Okay, so the pot size matters, which will affect your yield. All right. Now, I discussed this a little bit before in the sense that it will be expensive considering you're going to have to maintain a proper light source, heat source. Another problem is blossom and rot. Now, I'm going to talk about this problem in just a little bit, but this is very prevalent for those plants that are indoors. Okay, tomato plants I'm talking about, not just any, right? So tomato plants indoors, they're likely to get this problem, which is called blossom and rot. All right, so ground, what are the advantages? Well, the advantages are more than you might think. So the one big advantage of ground is that you'll get a larger crop yield, likely, right? So if you have more than 2 plants, if you're wanting to grow more than 2, the ground is probably a better option for you. Also, you have a greater range of variety. So for example, the best type of variety to grow in a pot would be a cherry tomato plant. Okay, so a cherry tomato plant would be the best variety. Now you're probably wondering, well, what about the Roma tomatoes or the beefsteak tomatoes, right? So the larger round ones, and we'll get into the varieties in just a little bit. Those larger varieties are likely better able to grow in ground versus pot. So for pot, you're limited to the variety, meaning cherry tomatoes is probably it. Again, it has to do with the size of the pot. So the larger the pot, the better. So in my 5-gallon pots, I am able to grow the larger varieties. So you can do that. If you have anything smaller than 5 gallons, then you probably want to stick to the cherry tomato. All right.
Asiyya,
yes.
Can you do the pots outdoors?
Yes, for sure. And you can take advantage of the growing season. So that's the advantage you would have of having the pots outdoors. And then of course, if you're planting in ground, that's also when you can take advantage of the growing season. So plant or the pots outdoors is the next best thing as compared to ground, right? So you have ground, you have pots outdoors, and then you have pot indoors, which would be my third preference if you must, right? So now some of the disadvantages of this is that obviously it requires space, right? So without this will essentially determine whether you're going to be growing in a pot or ground. All right. So let's go ahead and look at some of these growing schemes. Now, you have a multitude of choices. So what I just did for you is compare and contrast the garden versus, or the garden pot versus the garden bed, right? Or ground, right? So that's what we just compared and contrasted. What your options are this. You can either take tomato seeds directly and grow them in a pot. You can take tomato seeds and grow them in a garden bed, or you can do the following. And this is my preferred method, and I'll tell you why in just a little bit, is that you can take those tomato seeds, right? Create a transfer plant or a seedling and transfer the seedling into a pot or ground. All right. Now, why is it that you would want to, and I'm sure you've noticed this, right? So in garden centers, you'll have 2 varieties. You can either buy the seeds or you can buy a rather sometimes they refer to it as an immature plant, but really it's called a seedling plant. Okay, so you can buy these small plants, either put them in a pot, or you put them in the ground, your choice. Now, the reason why I prefer growing the seeds into a seedling plant is the following. When you go to the gardening centers, these seedling plants are usually around $4 to $5, right? So per plant. Now, when you purchase these seeds, you'll get approximately 30 to 50 seeds at the same price. So that's 30 to 50 plants, right? These can be potentially 30 to 50 plants versus one plant at the same price, right? There's a large price difference between seeds as well as seedling plants, right? So there's that price difference. Another factor is this. When you go into a gardening center, a lot of times for these seedling plants, the labels are switched around. You don't know what variety you're truly getting, right? Because essentially what you have is a little cardboard tag that's embedded within the soil that will tell you which variety you're buying. But really, that's not a good indication because obviously that can fly away and it gets switched around. There have been seasons where I've used a seedling plant, thought I have purchased a red tomato and have gotten yellow tomato with black stripes. And that was just a genetic variant, right? So tomatoes do come in all sorts of colors. So that was a surprise there. That was not my intention. So this is my preferred way, is that you can take the tomato seeds, create a seedling plant, and go straight into the garden bed. All right. So before we go through this process, I just want to highlight what do you need to have in your pot and what do you need to have in your garden bed if that's what you decide to do, right? All right, so what the garden bed is basically black dirt mixed with a compost or a manure mixture. All right, so black dirt is black dirt. You can purchase it and you can see it here from Miracle Grow Garden Soil All-Purpose Black Dirt. Okay, but what's the difference between compost and manure and why do you need it? The reason why you need either compost or manure is to revitalize the soil in the sense that you need to have a microflora within your soil. Microflora are the microorganisms that are present, which will help to break down different types of nutrients for the plant, okay? So it's going to provide nutrients for the plant. You need to have that microflora, and so compost and manure is how to achieve that. So what's compost? Compost is essentially kitchen scraps. And so what I mean by that, you can say fruit peels, vegetable peels, apple corks, right? Apple or banana peels, vegetable peels, any of that sort. Any kind of organic matter will really be compost. And manure, of course, is animal feces. Either one can be added to black dirt, and that can be the base of your garden bed. Now, I'm sure you might have tried this before. Try digging a hole in the soil that is outside. What you will find is that the soil of the Midwest is very, very hard. It's very clay-like, all right? It's gonna be very difficult to dig a hole. All right, so let's just take that off the books. So now, you're dealing with such hard material, and this black dirt that you buy is not gonna be the same composition. All right, so if you're getting the idea that perhaps I can take dirt from my lawn, if that is the case, then what you need to add, and you will have to add this to the black dirt as well, what you want to add is either perlite or peat moss. Perlite are these small little white specks that you see in potting soil, for example. So these white specks are actually small stones that are very porous, okay? And then peat moss and both perlite, what they will do is help to retain water in soil, okay? So it'll help to soften the soil to allow the roots to penetrate, and it will also increase the holding capacity of your soil, the water holding capacity. All right, so if you've ever also tested the pH of your soil in Illinois, what you'll find is that it is basic than what it needs to be, okay? So the soil pH in Illinois is around 8.5, What you want for your tomato plants is a pH between 6.5 and 7.5. Now, you might be wondering, well, why do you need to have this specific pH? pH plays a role in nutrient uptake. Okay, so if the roots are not in the correct pH, then they won't be able to uptake nutrients from the soil. And so maintaining the right pH range is critical. And so at that point, you want to add acidifiers, which you can purchase locally. All right. Now, there's going to be a whole section that I'll talk about in just a little bit about fertilizers. We'll get to that, but you want to add your fertilizer as the third component. Now, this is all true for a garden bed, okay, which is much larger structure as compared to your pot, which is going to be in the range again of that 2 to 5 gallon. And so what you can take is either take the mixture that I had mentioned above, or what you can do is simply take potting soil and you will be in good condition. So take potting soil, which has a lot of these components. So potting soil normally has this perlite, right? Oftentimes it is pH'd correctly, but you can verify by looking at the label of your potting soil. So a regular all-purpose potting soil should be in the right pH to grow your tomato plants. Now, what you will have to add to your potting soil is the fertilizer component, right? So if you're going in a pot, get your potting soil, make sure it's the right pH, and also purchase the fertilizer, which I'll talk about in just a little bit. All right. So now we're at that stage where we want to take our tomato seeds and we want to make a seedling plant. Okay. So I'll start off by first showing you the seed packets that I've purchased. So here they are. What this packet has, it has the name of the variety, right? So this is called Big Beef variety that I've purchased, right? It also has a set of instructions here which tell you exactly how deep to sow your seeds, what temperature to keep them, so on and so forth, and when to perform the transplant, right? So when you take your seedling plant and put it into the pot, or when you put it into the garden bed. It has this information here, but I'll go ahead and talk about it also, okay? But in case you're wondering, that information is provided for you. So what I'm going to do here is show you what the seeds look like, okay? So here are the seeds, okay? The seeds are in this bluish color that you see, bluish green color, and this is the size of a penny. Now, what you can see is these seeds are really tiny, obviously, and I just dropped one, but I think you got my point here. The seeds are really small and they have this bluish color. Now, normally tomato seeds don't have this color, okay? What this blue color is a coating. It's a fungicide coating that some seeds come with, okay? So some seeds have it. For other seeds, you sometimes have to apply a fungicide. It's not really that crucial of a component, but for these seeds that I've just shown you, they're coated in a fungicide which contains copper. And of course, and I'm sure Dr. Thomas would know this, right? So when copper oxidizes, it turns a different color. It's not going to be that red color anymore. That's why it's going to look blue or green in this case. All right, so those are the seeds. Now, let's go ahead and take our seeds and put them into our pot, right? Our small pot. This is our seedling that we're trying to grow right now. This is not the pot that the eventual plant will grow in, but rather the seedling pot, right? And what it is a small container essentially, okay? So what you wanna do is grow out your plant in a small container, and that's the seedling plant or the transfer plant, all right? So here you can see there's potting soil in here, okay? What's important at this step is that you will not need a fertilizer. Chances are you could overdose your plant if you were to add fertilizer at this step. Why? Because the seedling isn't going to need that many nutrients in order to outgrow, okay? So at this step, chances are you're not going to have to apply fertilizer. In fact, fertilizer might hurt as opposed to, making the process go along faster. So no fertilizer, just potting soil. And what I did is I took those same seeds and I covered them in approximately 1/4 of the soil, right? So 1/4 deep into soil. All right. What you can also probably notice is are these blue or green ends of the seed, right? You can still see remnants of the seed at the tip of the seedling. And again, that's just part of the outgrowth process. You can see parts of the seed still attached to the leaves of the seedling. Okay. All right. This again is a big beef variety that I had sown. So we'll talk about the varieties in just a little bit. So now this is important. When you're watering such a small container, all right, and this is a mistake I made when I started. And you know, it's an easy mistake to make. I feel like a lot of people might encounter this, so that's why I want to discuss it. What you're going to want to do is overwhelm this container with water. Okay, so you're going to, you know, probably fill up the pitcher and dunk it in here. Now, the problem is obviously if you do that, this is such a small volume, what you're going to have is the entire soil, including the seed, potentially overflowing. Okay, so what you want to do is water very slowly. Okay, this is an easy mistake to make. Even the small amount of water can overwhelm this container. All right, what also is important about a container like this is that you want to make protrusions at the opposite end of the containers just to allow for drainage to occur. Okay, so poke holes at the bottom. I don't typically do it at the very bottom. I do them on the sides so that whatever, you know, mixture is in here doesn't continue to come out. All right. So where do you want to keep this? You want to keep this in a relatively warm climate. Okay, so I'm talking about between 75 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit to allow for germination to occur for that seed to sprout. Okay, now this is interesting. You can actually keep this, if the seed is under the soil, you can keep this in the dark environment. Okay, so you don't have to provide it any light at this step. Why is that? Because the leaves haven't come out. It's not going to start the process of photosynthesis yet. It's going to try to acquire all of its nutrients from the soil that is in the container. Okay, so you can keep it in the dark. Now you will keep it in the dark for about 4 to 7 days. Okay, so it'll take 4 to 7 days for the seed to germinate. Now, a lot of these, you know, when you purchase the packet, it'll tell you how many days to keep in mind. So for this specific variety, it says 6 to 14 days. This range can vary depending on which type of seeds you're planting. Okay, so if you're purchasing this from a good company, a lot of times they do give you all this information. I'll tell you which companies I've had a good good luck with, if you will, right? All right, so now once the seed has germinated, this is when you can put the plant under grower lights. And what you want to do is make sure that you provide the plant with approximately 8 to 14 hours of this grow light exposure. Okay, you want to make sure that's around that range, at least. 8 is minimum. Okay? Anything less than 8, you're going to affect germination. Chances are your seeds won't germinate. So at least 8. Okay. All right. So now it again tells you how long you want to keep this seedling indoors before you transplant. Okay, it tells you. So in this case, it says 5 to 6 weeks. In my experience, this has been around 4 to 6 weeks. Okay, 4 is minimum. Okay, 4 is minimum before you perform the transplant. Why? You want the roots to develop to a stage where you can perform this transplant. Okay. Again, this upper range, this 5 to 6 weeks, it's going to depend on how the weather is outside, right? So let's get to that. So in the Midwest, obviously, our growing season is short, and so you'll be performing this transplant typically the first or second week of May. Okay, so first or second week of May is when you want this to happen. Whenever it is the case that you don't get any freezing nights, right? So if the temperature is dipping below 32 degrees at night, that would not be a good time to perform the transplant. Okay, so this typically happens first or second week of May. All right, and so here's the plant that we're trying to transplant. Now, before I perform this transplant, what I want to do is make sure that I water, right? What the water will do is that once I've performed the transplant, this process is very traumatizing for the plant, okay? It's likely for a good 6 hours or so not going to intake any nutrients and is not going to take in any water. And so you want to provide this bolus ahead of time before you perform the transplant. So that's why the day before the transplant, that's when you want to water it. All right. So like I had said, this process of transplanting, it is quite abrasive, right? And so you want to do this at night, right? So when the next day, right? So you water it, you wait the next day. The next day, you want to do the transplant at night. Why? Because the light and the sun exposure is going to be quite abrasive. If you do this during the day, it's not going to be detrimental, but your plant will have a harder time establishing in the new environment if that's the case, right? Okay, so now let's talk about maintenance, okay? So water is a big deal. You can underwater or overwater very easily when it comes to tomato plants. Here's a good tip as far as watering the plant is concerned. If you notice the leaves wilting, obviously that's usually pretty late, okay? Not that you can't water at that step. That means that a lot of time has passed by. So a good indicator is the soil surrounding the main stem. If that soil looks cracked and dry, that's when you want to water it. The best test to make sure you've watered it enough is to just touch the soil, okay? When you touch it and you can see the residues of the soil has stuck to my finger, this is a good indicator that the soil is moist. However, you don't want it to be soaking wet, okay? So if you have water standing, close to that main branch, that means you've overwatered, okay? So after watering, if water is still standing for a good 2, 3, 4 hours close to that main stem, that's a problem, right? Because that means you're overwatering. So a good indicator, again, is a touch test. Just touch the soil, see if it's moist. That'll be a good indication. Now, of course, we can make that problem if we have our plants indoors, and in that, to maintain the temperature, we can put it close to a vent. This is a no-no, right? So that's going to further dehydrate your plant. That's not going to be good, right? Okay, so support, right? You're going to have to purchase these tomato cages. Now, either you can use these tomato cages because this is a vine plant, right? It's going to have vines. And so you want to support these minor branches using perhaps twist and ties, right? So go ahead and take the minor branches and tie them to the cage so that the main branch in the middle can continue to grow. Now you can use this, or you can also just use a bamboo stick, okay? And that's what I do in my own garden, is I use bamboo sticks. It works as efficiently. Really just the supporting structure is what your tomato plant's gonna need. Okay, so let's talk about pruning, all right? Now, in order to prune your plant, and you can look at this schematic that I have to your right-hand side, what you see is this main growing stem, okay? That's where it's labeled growing tip. That very main structure, that's the main stem, or the growing stem, if you will. What you have protruding onto the sides, those are the minor stems, okay? So you have the minor stems, and then you have the main stem. Where the minor stem meets the main stem, that structure is called the axil, okay? That's where you want to look at, okay? So now focus on the axil. If there is another branch trying to come off of that axil besides the minor branch from the main stem, that is called the sucker, okay? And what that is the plant is trying to grow in size, okay? It's trying to create another main stem. Okay, and so that's what you want to cut off, are the suckers, okay? And again, the suckers are at the junction between the minor and the main stems, okay? So that is going to help to maintain a larger crop yield. All right, So let me just tell you this, is that when you walk into your garden center and you look at the fertilizer aisle, it's very daunting, to say the least, right? You're going to see aisles and aisles and aisles of fertilizer, and for good reason. Each type of crop needs a certain formulation, and there's going to be so many different types of companies. All right. So there's two things you want to keep in mind when you're trying to purchase a fertilizer, which is going to be important for your tomato plant. Okay. The first number is this. It's the NPK ratio. What this ratio is a nitrogen to phosphorus to potassium ratio. Okay. So when you look at the labels of your fertilizer, make sure you look at this ratio, the NPK ratio. Okay. So each one of these elements, right? So nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, they're going to play a certain and specific role as to the growth of your plant, right? So for example, nitrogen will help your plant get wider, right? So leaf growth, right? So phosphorus will help your plant grow deeper, right? So roots, as well as fruit growth. Potassium will help your plant grow taller, right? So this is supporting structures such as the stems, right? So as well as fruit. And so all of these nutrients play a key role as far as plant growth is concerned. And so you need to have a good balance of each one. Now, the ratios that I like, that I, in my experience, have worked well for me is the 14-14-14 ratio, meaning that there's 14% nitrogen, 14% phosphorus, and 14% potassium. Okay, now here's the key deal. The key deal is that you need to look at what type of fertilizer this is. This ratio only works well if you have the granular slow release fertilizers. Okay, so not only do you have to take a look at the ratio, but you have to look at the type of fertilizer. And I'll talk about the types in just a little bit. But this 14-14-14, this is a granular slow release fertilizer. Okay, so next let's look at the types of fertilizers, right? And actually, I have one here, right? So I actually have this one. This is the Osmocote. And then again here, you might be able to see this is the ratio. This is the 14-14-14, maybe not, okay. But hopefully you can see what that looks like, all right? So the different types. You have three main varieties of fertilizers. The first kind are water soluble, and with water soluble fertilizers, these are some things that you have to use almost on a weekly basis. So perhaps every 2 weeks, this is the time that you would want to add your fertilizer, every 2 weeks, once every 2 weeks. Okay, it comes as a powder, you mix it with water, you apply it to your plants, all is well and good. Now this granular type is the one that I was showing you, the Osmocote, okay, and the grains are really small. The grains will remind you of a coriander seed. So it has that size about, right? So you've got your coriander seed size, if you will, okay? Now, there are two types of granular, right? There's the immediate release as well as the slow release. Immediate release, this is when, again, you'd want to do it on a weekly basis, approximately once every 1 to 4 weeks, okay? Now, your slow release is another type, and that's the one I showed you. For our growing season, since our growing season is so short, you likely only have to apply this once, okay? So, for example, you only have to do it once every 3 months. If our growing season's only 4 to 5 months, then chances are you might only have to apply this once, okay? Maybe twice, all right? So this really depends on your growing season. Now, why do I use this? Why do I use the slow release? Two things. Tomato plants are heavy eaters, okay? They need to have a constant nutrient supply, okay? The second reason is this. You can overdose on these nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium very easily for tomato plants. And so with slow release, you get a constant maintenance of nutrients for the plant. Typically, it is one that works the best for our tomato plants, okay? Another is an organic variety, Okay, and organic can mean that it has sea kelp, bone meal, right? So I've listed them here. Each one of these provides a specific aspect to the fertilizer. So for example, eggshells, calcium, blood meal will provide nitrogen and iron, right? Sea kelp, minor minerals. So you can use a combination of these, but for a novice gardener, I don't recommend this, right? Purchase, and if you want to use organic, use a proprietary blend such as Tomato Tone. I've used that. I've had success with it. It's a good blend. And so if you want to go with a organic variety, this is a good one. Okay. So just to give you a idea as to the different types you have on the market, right? So you have this variety, which is called let me just move the screen here, right? So you have a variety which is referred to as beefsteak tomatoes, right? So there's beefsteak, cherry, as well as paste tomatoes, okay? Now, all of them vary depending on the composition as well as shape primarily, okay? So your beefsteak tomatoes are the round ones and large, okay? So they're round and large, and the variety that I like to grow is called Big Beef, okay? So this is the variety that I actually showed you the seeds from. This is that Big Beef variety, right? And this is, again, that same variety that I'm creating this seedling plant. All right. So besides that is the cherry tomatoes. And what I like to use is the Sweet 100 or the Sun Gold. The Sun Gold variety was that the orange yellow variety that I had shown you. That variety is my personal favorite. Why? Because it almost tastes like grapes because it has a high sugar content. And so you find yourself confused as to whether you're eating a vegetable or a fruit. Personally speaking, I'd like to think I'm eating a fruit, so hence the sweeter variety, which is the Sun Gold. Sweet 100 is also sweeter or sweet, but not as sweet as the Sun Gold variety. All right, then we have our paste tomatoes. These are the ones typically by which you'll see ketchup is made from, right? So ketchup or marinara sauce, these are your paste tomatoes. They're oval in shape, and they'll have a higher pulp content as compared to juice. The variety that I like to grow is Roma. I also have another variety that I'm trying out. It's called Granadino. So this is another variety that I'll be trying out, and I'll let you know how that goes. So fingers crossed. All right, so common problems, right? So what are things that you might see that are prevalent with tomato plants as far as different either diseases, infections, or just problems in general as far as growth, okay? So I had discussed with you, or at least referred to the blossom end rot, right? And so what is this, okay? So that you can see an image of this in the presentation, right? So the very top picture, this is when your plant develops this dark patch. And what you'll see at that region where it forms that dark patch is a complete rotting of the fruit, okay? So the fruit will continue to rot until it gets to the stem, okay? So the rot will start at the bottom or the opposite side of the stem, or you can think of this as the end of the blossom, and continue to degrade the entire fruit, okay? So you can end up with tomatoes that look like they've been cut in half with a black patch on one end and be like, where is my fruit, right? Where is the tomato? Why doesn't it have the correct shape? Well, it's blossom end rot. And the reason why plants get this, tomato plants, and especially potting tomato plants, is because there's too many wet and dry cycles, and there's not enough calcium or magnesium in soil, okay? Now, how do you fix this? And that's the problem with pot plants, is that's very hard to maintain the right amounts of water in soil. Why? Because you don't have a lot of it, right? You're constrained by the size of the pot. And so you're regularly trying to maintain the water levels, and they're really important, especially when it comes to trying to deal with this problem. Not only is water important, right, to try to maintain a constant amount, but also calcium as well as magnesium. The way you can counter those, you can add Epsom salt, something as easy as Epsom salt for magnesium, or you can add gypsum or lime for calcium. All right. Another problem that you might see is tomato cracking, especially for those more meatier tomato varieties, right? The larger tomato varieties. You might actually have seen this already. So why do they happen? Again, it has to do with the hydration, right? The wet and dry cycle. Now, the reason why this happens is that, let's say, for example, you have a drought, right? During the time of a drought, what happens is that the peel becomes very, very thick. And so when you have onput of water, right? So let's say you're in that wet season now. So the drought is gone. Now it's heavy rains. Heavy rains come about and your tomato plant thinks that, uh-oh, there might be another dry spell. It takes up more water than it can handle. Okay, so the pulp gets very enlarged and that's going to induce cracks in the peel. All right. That is one problem. Another problem is this early blight. Early blight is a fungal infection, okay? And this is first seen on the leaves of your tomato plant. So what you're gonna have is a situation where your leaves are gonna accumulate black spots that are really small. They're very hard to see. The leaf is gonna turn brown, yellow, and eventually fall off. And so how do you identify this in comparison to either other infections, because there are other infections that look like this? And how do you compare and contrast this with something where you haven't hydrated your plant enough? Because that is the very first things that get affected, is the shape of the leaves if there's not proper hydration. So how do you differentiate early blight with all those other problems? And the way is this. Take a close look at the dark spots. And you might be able to see this in the picture that I'm showing. You see these concentric rings, right? This target-like pattern. And that is what's indicative of early blight, which is a fungal infection. And so simply the way to deal with this is to purchase a fungicide, and you should be in good shape. Mind you, I'm saying should be, and I'm cringing a little bit because that's the idea. However, this is contagious. So if you have other plants nearby, and you have other plants, meaning that if you throw away and discard this plant, you'll have others, that's probably the best bet at this point, if you're able to see this pattern on the leaves, right?
Definite comments that we've all run into this. We've seen these issues before.
Yeah. So they're pretty prevalent. So let's go ahead and now talk about end of the season, okay? So your plant is giving off its fruit, you've enjoyed it. All right, now it comes to wrapping things up. And so when does that happen? That happens usually for Chicago, first week of October when you get the first frost, okay? So frost is a good measure of how long your growing season is, right? So for example, when you stop getting frost, that's a good time to go ahead and plant. And then when it comes back around, that's a good time to end, right? So that the frost is a good indication of when to start and when it ends. All right. Now, this is something that we might want to think about, especially when it comes to our garden beds. You might think that you do not need to remove the dead plant parts, right? So clean out your garden beds or clean out your pot. You might think that it's a good idea because eventually it'll just turn into fertilizer, right? So that's common thinking. And that's, in a way, it could be that case, but it's more likely before your plants are able to fully degrade, there is a chance, and that's why it's recommended to clean out the garden bed and the pots, is that they can become infected, right? So if you have dying plants, chances are their immune defenses are gone, right? They're slowly withering out. And so it's perfect time for infection, okay? And if your infection can last the winters, so a lot of these fungal infections can last the winter, and you plant, you know, the next season, you're going to see those infections come to life, right? So your new plants will end up getting these infections that were due to the decaying plant foliage that you left behind the last season. Okay, so cleaning out the garden beds and pots is important. Now, how do you rejuvenate for the next season? Well, you can add nutrients to your garden bed, and for your pot, you can either throw out your potting soil into your garden bed, okay, or you can rejuvenate it by adding the fertilizer and the compost. Okay, so those are all options there. Now, you can harvest your own seeds. I don't recommend it. I recommend you purchasing your own seeds. Why don't I recommend it? Because these are F1 hybrids usually. What that means is that if you try to grow these, there's a chance that you might not end up with the same plant that you had originally planted. Okay, meaning that the lineage will diverge. Okay, I know I'm running out of time. Let me just get to the most important points. So besides tomato plants, herbs are a really good if you're into home gardening. Why? Because they have a high price, right? So basil, I just looked this up last night, $4.59 for 1.25 ounce of fresh basil from Jewel, right? So that is quite expensive. And so it could be cost effective to do these at home. Again, how would you do basil? You would do it, I do it the same way that I do plants, but instead of doing it in the garden bed, I do it in a pot, right? So I create the transfer plant or seedling from seed, and then I take it from there. Okay, so these are some of the commercial seed vendors that I use. Okay, so Johnny's Selected Seeds, right? We've got Harris Seeds and Burpee. These are all reputable vendors that sell tomato seeds. Okay, so now the pictures I showed you, they're not my own. Okay, so these are some sources. These are pictures from my own garden. So these were taken June of last year. That's why you can see that the fruit is still green. I have a basil plant here at the bottom. On the left, you can see some cherry varieties, right? So that's the Sweet 100 on one side, and then you can see the orange color one on the other, which is the Sun Gold. All right. Well, if you have any questions, feel free to send me an email. Okay, it's my first name dot last name at morton.edu. Definitely send me an email if you have any questions, and I can pass it on over to Dr. Hamas.
So you have a comment in the chat. I know you can't see the chat. It's like, I've learned so much. This is a great presentation. Thank you very much.
Great, great.
And question from Edie, how long does it take the fruit to grow from seedling? Like, so once you have your seedling, how long are you waiting?
So the fruit, there's also a waiting period as far as ripening is concerned. So there's a time between, you can say, the first time that you see fruit, signs of fruit, to when you can actually pick the fruit, right? This can take close to 3 weeks from the time where you can see the fruit coming to harvesting. So half a month, usually, I would say, is a better estimate of signs of fruit to actually seeing fruit. So like I said, what you can see here in my own home garden, right? So this is June of 2020. I had started this process in May, right? So that's when you do the transplant of the seed for the actual plant into ground. And so this is June of 2020. And so from here on out, it should take approximately a week to 2 weeks for this fruit to be harvestable. Right, so the process starts in May when you have the fruit in ground, and then it ranges from then on, from when you're able to see this fruit to the fruit ripening to the harvest.
And follow-up question, how do you combat squirrels or wildlife from your garden?
Squirrels, wildlife. Let me tell you, tomato plants, and I don't know why this is, they are not targeted by rabbits, squirrels, and birds. You might think they are. Birds will come for the juice. Okay, so that's for sure. Let me tell you, so next to these tomato plants, I have eggplants, and that's what the rabbits come for. Okay, squirrels, I haven't seen squirrels. come for these tomato plants. So really, that hasn't been a problem for me. I'd imagine a scarecrow would be a good idea, right? So potentially a human-like figure in the vicinity. Really, I haven't encountered this to really be able to say. What could help is garlic. So garlic plants do help ward off squirrels. So not only, bats, but like squirrels as well, and rabbits. So I've planted garlic plants next to tomato plants, and that has worked out well.
And you have another comment that this has been wonderful. I have my daughter in Girl Scouts, and we dabbed a bit with seeds last summer, and we really wanted to continue this year. So
awesome. Sounds good. Great. Yeah. So hopefully everyone was able to take down some sort of notes as far as how the process just naturally develops, right? So from seed to actual plant to fruit. Really, that was the goal, and hopefully you're able to take something from that.
Yeah, it says lots of notes. Thank you. And yeah, I never knew the whole thing about transplanting at night. Like I knew it, it stressed the plants, but I'd never heard that before. And so.
Yeah, the whole process of transplant is traumatizing for the plant, right? Considering you're not uprooting it, so you are taking the potting soil that's in the small container into, whichever vessel you want to put it in. But that is a concern, to get the plant established in the new environment. So, yeah.
So just a few comments to round us out. My mother recently started this. I'm going to pass along my notes, and thank you so much. I feel equipped to try again.
Definitely. This is, do small experiments. That's what I say. Every season, just have this on the back burner. Don't think, too much ahead. Try to fine tune your technique first. And that's where you begin, really. So do continue the small experiments. That's what I would say for sure. Every year, something small. It doesn't have to be big.
All right. Well, thank you again. Thanks everyone for coming. We hope you have a fantastic weekend. And if you know any women who are interested in a career in healthcare, our next session is tomorrow morning with a healthcare panel. We have doctors, nurses, physicians assistants, and physical therapists, just to talk a little bit about what it's like to be in their career. So we hope to see you then or at any of our other remaining sessions this month. Until then, have a great evening.